Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our session this afternoon. It's titled Dispossession, Post-Irma, Ragged Island, and Disaster Capitalism. After the presentation, it will be followed, the presentation will be followed by a live Q&A segment. And please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. All right, let's turn over to our presenters.
Hi, welcome to our panel on disaster capitalism in Ragged Island post Hurricane Irma. Thank you for being with us. We are a group of students and faculty from the University of the Bahamas who went to Ragged Island to gather data in 2018 and to photograph what happened. We were joined by Ethan Knowles from the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, who was then a student resident working at the NHEB, and he went on the trip with us and became a part of the workshop. The work really was geared towards an installation called Hot Water. And I think here Nantino will take over and introduce the actual presentation. Thank you.
Go ahead. Good evening or good morning, whatever time you're watching this. So our project is Dispossession, Post-Irma, Ragged Island, and Disaster Capitalism. My name is Nantino Thompson. Like Dr. Bethel Bennett would have stated, we went and we did this research in 2018. And it was a very interesting kind of dynamic to go down to Ragged Island and just be amongst the people. Yeah, so I think that Diandra will start us off and then we'll go from there. Sorry.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. While its geographical positioning has afforded the Bahamas its tropical climate, which often makes the country a favorite destination for tourists and investors alike, this positioning also situates us directly in the path of hurricanes. Due to climate change issues, specifically global warming and rising sea levels, the intensity and the frequency of these storms are ever increasing. And so we've noticing that there's a pattern that, every other year or so there are these storms that are forming very quickly, and they're very strong, and they pretty much wreak havoc within certain islands of the Bahamas. So within the last decade, the Bahamas has experienced devastation and loss because of hurricanes in a way that it has not before. For the most part, the capital, New Providence, has avoided significant damage and loss in ways that the Family Islands have not. Unfortunately, we are noticing that successive governments are garnering a reputation of failing to respond adequately to Family Islands in the wake of these devastating storms, and leaving communities and significant portions of the island, in some cases, in disrepair. So as both Nantino and Dr. Bethel Bennett have said, our case study looks specifically at Ragged Island in the wake of Hurricane Irma, which touched down in 2017. So we're about four years out. And we are positing that climate change has many striking visual impacts, but we maintain the less evident repercussions, those perpetrated by the agents of disaster capitalism, may actually pose a greater threat to the livelihoods of vulnerable communities in the Bahamas. And so it's very important for us to, as we're doing this study, to be cautioned or to be wary of the narratives that are being produced that kind of gloss over this ongoing dispossession of hurricane-ravaged islands. And so this presentation ultimately seeks to bring light and to remember the stories of those who are on the front line of the climate crisis. With that being said, I'm going to pass it on over to Nantino.
Okay. So while, as Diandra would have said, we're seeking to ensure that we don't forget these stories, because one of the things that we've kind of uncovered or discovered, um, or I guess in our attempt to reclaim the narratives that have been lost, we've seen just exactly how that process has occurred. And so this project in particular focuses on how that has happened since Irma, and the ways that we should be looking at each process or each step in order to combat it, and to come up with a new narrative, as well as point to very specific moments within the actual events of which have occurred, to bring about an awareness of the space and what has taken place. One of the things that we've seen, as you see on the screen, is that these are some of the images that we came across in 2018. But I'm going to walk over to a video with the former prime minister talking about his idea of making Ragged Island a green island within the region, the first within the region. And I think that we'll start once we start from there, we'll be able to chronologically chart exactly what actually happened, and balance or see exactly how the counter narratives to what the prime minister actually said occurred versus what actually occurred. Those, I guess, the disparities or the inequalities between the actual narratives will become apparent to you, right?
In the Bahamas began in 2017 after Hurricane Irma, another Category 5 storm, tore through tiny Ragged Island at the southern tip of the island chain.
After Ragged Island is devastated, I made a statement. Let us show the world what can be done. We may be small, but we can set an example to the world.
So it's your goal to make Ragged Island a green island.
Absolutely. Absolutely. After which we can expand it. We can expand it.
So here we see the former prime minister talking about his idea. Yeah. So in March of 2019, Ragged Island then received its first adequate supply of water. Up until that point, so that's almost a year later, right? They had no running water. And then in 2020, residents had expressed their frustrations about being neglected and abandoned by the government, right? And then I think it was early in January 2021, where we saw the first signs of the government actually taking responsibility and beginning to build, I think it was a $2.5 million construction of the services that they needed to offer, which will house a community center, the school, teachers' residents, and all of the things that the residents had been asking for. But this took 4 years to occur. And yet we see the narrative that he was actually touting on 60 Minutes, which I think is a great disparity. So the theoretical underpinnings, which come from Harvey's New Imperialism, states that capitalism really induces prices, right? And the inducing of prices is meant for a few things, in that it ejects laborers or people out of the systematic structure, thereby creating an quote unquote industrial reserve army. And it does so because as capitalism develops in stages, the idea is that there will be a ready, available set of human capital ready to spur on the momentum of the new stage of capitalism and neoliberalist kind of policies, which then makes available a huge excess of capital for overconsumption and eventually accumulation by dispossession. In this same token, capitalism also manufactures the other. And I think this is important because, again, if human rights are being neglected or being divested, the responsibility is being divested onto the citizens, and which are left to fend for themselves against transnational companies or global companies, we see that capitalism in and of itself is a very volatile system, which Harvey talks about. However, those who are othered by capitalism are done so with the intention that they will stabilize the volatile system, right? And so therefore the ejection or the marginalization or the oppression of a group of people is in direct relation to the stability of capitalism and the neoliberalist stages within that facilitate accumulation by dispossession. And then Harvey talks about the process of proletarianization, which essentially is that you make people proletariats, but he talks about making them a landless proletariats. So it's not like in the feudal system, you're divesting them you're divesting the government or the government themselves is divesting of themselves of the responsibility to protect the people. The people are then left defenseless, and their land, their access to healthcare, their basic fundamental human rights will not be met. The terms under which they operate or fend for themselves is basically an unequal kind of dynamic, power dynamic. When we go on to Naomi Klein's Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein talks about how shocks are induced again, so that narratives are skewed, so that there's no way that you can recount what has happened to you. And when you're disoriented in that fashion, it's very hard for you to lay hold or claim to what has happened or make sense of what has happened. So when things like Irma and Dorian have happened, what we see is that legislation is passed in the form of the Disaster Preparedness and Response Act, which effectively, again, divests the government of the responsibility to protect people, right, its citizens, and leaves the citizens defenseless and basically open or prey with this predatory behavior to be exploited, to be dispossessed of the land, and for that land then to fall into the hands of transnational companies through the means of privatization. And I think that that's something else that Harvey talks about, because he talks about the privatization, how that in hand with the credit system and foreign direct investment all work together in this very synchronistic kind of way to ensure that that there is no mounting of opposition against what is happening under capitalism. And so what we see is the hegemonic state power. It creates these unequal asymmetries, right? Or these unequal power dynamics, which allow for accumulation by dispossession, which allows this excess capital to come into the hands of the already rich, and makes it doubly difficult for those who once had land, those who are oppressed, to regain control over that which has been lost. I will pass it over. I think that I will pass it over to Ethan. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, thank you for that, Nantino. If you don't mind just heading back to the previous slide. Great. Alrighty. So as you can see in this image, this is actually one of the photos that I took on Ragged Island. We did our anthropological trip. back in 2018. And this is the interior of the all-age school, which was ravaged during the passing of Irma. This is just one of the structural facilities that was totaled and rendered unusable during the passage of that hurricane. And there also was a police station that was compromised, various administrative buildings, a health clinic, and various other structures that communities in that on that island rely on. The issues with the destruction of these key social aspects of social architecture is not only that the population does not have access to basic services, it's also a threat to cultural security. So as you would have heard earlier, the sort of detriment of climate change is not only that it induces climate migrations and mass exoduses due to rendering places uninhabitable, it also puts in jeopardy communities' ability to access, carry on, and carry out their cultural practices. So expanding on the discussion about disaster capitalism, I would posit that as crucial institutions, schools, community centers, public facilities, fall to worsening storms induced by an exacerbated climate crisis, and government officials who are also facilitating disaster capitalism. This is something that I would like to point out. It's not just these transnational companies coming in and sort of co-opting the land and sort of invading the space. It's also the government not enacting sufficient legislation and allowing the facilitation of this dispossession. So, like I was saying, as these critical institutions and structures fall and people are forced to move further and further afield from their places of residence origin, as we were seeing with the issue of Ragged Island in 2018 and the dwindling population that is currently seen on that island, we run a greater risk as a climate crisis increases to become more and more severe of losing important aspects of cultural diversity, not only at the national level, but also at the regional level. So this is an issue for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a question of mental health. If populations are not able to access the sense of identity brought on by that which is passed through generation, this develops a society that is insecure, that is not sure of itself, and promises issues at the national level for development. Indeed, as livelihoods and the spaces in which those livelihoods unfold are compromised, citizens of the Bahamas, residents of Ragged Island, citizens of the broader Caribbean, and all of us living in small island developing states risk losing our linguistic diversity, access to folk tales, traditions, and other cultural staples. It is therefore imperative that not only institutions, but also individuals do our best to document and preserve these stories of communities at the forefront of the climate crisis. And whether that be through anthropological work, literary and cinematic production, or simply word of mouth, we can endeavor to safeguard cultural security at both the national and regional levels, not least in the face of detrimental narratives purported by certain media bodies, maybe the government itself, which suggests that the best has been done, when in reality we know that is not the case. So going forward, it's really, this presentation hopes to stress the importance of not really sort of falling and settling into comfortable narratives that are fed to us by bodies in power, but trying to remember, trying to document, and trying to sort of carry on the stories, narratives, and the lived experience of those people who are vulnerable to a climate crisis that we've seen in the case of Irma and in the case of Dorian, which was the worst hurricane to strike the Bahamas on record. So as mentioned earlier by Nantino, the theorist Klein posits that one of the biggest issues when hurricanes strike these vulnerable islands is not just the catastrophic event itself, but the lack of preparedness and the absence of an effective response. In this way, we kind of notice the role of the government and the bodies in power that they play in maintaining or mitigating the effects of a climate crisis and ensuring that cultural heritage sort of whether intangible or tangible, intangible being traditions, practices, speech patterns and whatnot, intangible being like monuments, crafts, physical documents, ensuring that these aspects of culture are not compromised, or if they are compromised, stored in other forms and are allowed to be passed down and propagated throughout not only the society, but the generations of society that are to follow. So yeah, and this was a similar case that was observed on Antigua and Barbuda. We noted during our research that many cultural sites were compromised in that region, in those two islands, and the issue in that case was not only a fact of many sort of these sites not being designated as tangible cultural heritage, but also the government's inability to protect and maintain and ensure the sustainability of these practices, these spaces, and these aspects of cultural heritage. So yeah, so projects like these and work like this seeks to sort of place, to center kind of narratives that would otherwise be erased, overlooked, and lost in the face of climate change.
I also would like to add that it is imperative for us to, with work like this, through these kinds of projects, that we speak truth to power and we hold governments accountable, because it is this continued negligence is a violence that is committed against the citizens and the residents of these countries. As citizens and residents of countries, there are certain rights and benefits that are allowed to us, and as I've said in the introduction, it's seemingly become a pattern, especially here, that in the aftermath of these very large storms, that there is not sufficient response, and that is concerning, because people within the Caribbean regions are not strangers to storms. We experience hurricanes every year. So for governments, particularly in our case, to say that there is no way that they could have foreseen, the extent of the damage, or there's no way that they could have known how bad things could have been if certain things were put into place. And Nantino and I have worked on a similar project where we've talked about the importance of maintenance. We've talked about the importance of putting in policy and putting that policy into practice, so that the citizens can have something to rely on. That's very important for governments to do, because it is entitled. Citizens are entitled to that kind of support and that help from their government.
All right, so I think we can move to the final slide and just kind of leave that open-ended question, which.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
I did Dr. Bennett, did you want to say something before we conclude? Sorry.
Sure. So what we have, and I'm grateful for this opportunity again with the students, what we have is not just dispossession or accumulation by dispossession, but a generated or fabricated crisis that throws people into chaos that then allows the trauma to build and destabilize further. So the longer, as you see from the photos in Ragged Island, the longer Ragged Island stands unprepared or unrepaired, the easier it is to convince people that it is uninhabitable. And the easier it is to get the people off the land and put them somewhere else. So not only does the government have a duty of care to provide for its citizens, it is also not meant to remove spaces from the commons without the consent of the people. Although, as seen in Barbuda and Antigua, or the government of Antigua removed the people from the commons in Barbuda and changed the law while they were not in possession of their land, so that what was once common space or commonly held within the collective of Barbudan society was then turned into private space that could be bartered, sold, and otherwise leveraged to provide tourism, more space within the Caribbean ecosystem. And there you have the other side of the tangible, intangible cultural heritage dilemma, where the space of tangible culture, forts, historical sites, beaches, ports, bays, are erased, and so that the intangible practices that carry on there are removed. So once the memory of those tangible spaces is gone, the intangible cultural practices, the intangible cultural belonging, connections is also lost. And this is what our cultural institutions need to be more engaged in preventing, protecting against. And then you have the accumulation of those tangible cultural sites behind gated communities, which is great for the economy, supposedly, but not necessarily great for the performance of a national identity or regional identities. Again, in the case of the Bahamas, each island and each community within small islands has its own unique identity and its cultural practices. So none of the communities are hegemonically or homogeneously Bahamian to an extent that the tourism image represents us to be. From Hurricane Dorian, another experience that has led to a huge move in disaster capitalism, each part of Abaco is unique, and the experiences of each group of people in those spaces is unique. Now, bringing that into a national paradigm is troublesome because it does not fit within this idea of a monolithic history, identity, geography, culture that is perpetuated and sold and then consumed by the citizens. So it's sold as a tourist product, but it's consumed by the people that it is representing as their identity. And the performance of that identity then becomes damaged. So you have traditional knowledge that is eradicated, not just through accumulation by international pharmaceutical groups, but also the performance of those indigenous rights and practices that are then consumed and reproduced in a different context and privatized, which again, the cultural institutions need to figure out how we adapt to climate change and address these power asymmetries, because capital will always have the power to remove the commons if it goes unmitigated. And that speaks to a colonialism that has remained steadfastly in place, and not just about colonialism in terms of the direct rule, but colonialism in terms of a coloniality of thinking that has to be decolonized. And so that decolonialism perhaps may lend to a different understanding of cultural space. So again, Ragged Island provides a moment in hot water where you have climate change, climate crisis, climate refugees that are internally displaced, relocated to a capital that they don't want to be in, but little by little, all the islands from the southern Bahamas have been so depopulated, so displaced and so dislocated that the cultural practices within those spaces and the inhabitants are dispossessed and lost. Again, this goes back to the institutions like universities, museums, galleries, archives, forts, being buttressed by policies and grants that would allow them to be much more powerful in organizing, recognizing, acknowledging, and empowering communities within their spaces to be not so much place-centered as in the physical place of a building or a school or a park, but space-centered and also much more virtual as opposed to fixed. Ironically, the Bahamas, as we move more deeply into climate change, sea level rise, and neoliberalism, has become far more fixed in its locatedness, in its inability to change its paradigm. And as we mentioned earlier, the way that it responds to the crisis is by legislating in a reactive manner that empowers government to remove people from the land and keep them off until it sees fit to allow them back on, if it does allow them back on, because the greater good is always served by improving capitalist grasp of the green, blue, and orange economies, even when it becomes consumed by hyperinflation and a transnational world that exists nowhere really, but exists everywhere virtually. So I will hand it back over to Nantino, Diandra, and Ethan.
I think we have a couple more minutes, 7 more minutes to be exact. Before we go to the live Q&A, I think that what Diandra said is very important. Holding our governments accountable means that we have to come up with movements that defy the system of capitalism, that take into account the stages, the neoliberalist stages, and any other stage that comes about after these conditions that we've been able to, I guess, theorize and put into practice. One of the things that we know for sure is that the system is always adjusting and adjusting itself to accommodate more ways of accumulation, more ways of oppression, more ways of exploitation, more ways of dispossession. And so it's necessary for us within our particular spaces, and I think it's the hope of this particular project to suggest that that we need to within our own spaces come up with new ideas that can push back against and create new avenues that begin to hold the government accountable. I think one of the things that we have to do is stop the government from divesting its responsibility. And that's something that I see continuously in the Bahamas. So again, we mentioned the Dorian being the storm that it was. The bill that was passed, or the legislation that was passed, the Disaster Preparedness and Response Act, it again does exactly what Dr. Bennett talks about. It essentially gives the government or the Minister of Disaster and Preparedness and Response the ability to remove people or not allow people onto their land, right? And they once they give you the okay to evacuate, or once they tell you to evacuate, if you do not evacuate, essentially that piece of legislation, then they can find you guilty of an offense. So they criminalize the fact that you won't leave your home, never minding the fact that shelters weren't in place, or shelters are never prepared for you to house or facilitate these people or their citizens. They're not paying for you to get off the island, but they will criminalize and that behavior and make you pay for defying of the very act. And then once you're off of the island, there's no degree of certainty that you will ever return. And that's the dispossession that we're talking about. Most of the citizens are, sorry.
At the same time, agree with Nantino, it's like the paucity of services within those spaces almost necessitates the evacuation of citizens out of those spaces because the infrastructure has been allowed to dilapidate, or because the institutions have not been maintained. So yeah, it's a combination of unintentional neglect and intentional biopiracy or bio exploitation and spatial violence and spatial and structural violence. So
yeah, and I would say that spatial structural, and epistemic, because this is on about what you know, knowledge. It's knowledge based. It's epistemic violence at its core. And those advantages which the government have in its hands, the tools that they have at their disposal, they weaponize them against the people that they should be protecting in the interest of capital. And they themselves become defenders of this neoliberalist agenda, this capitalist regime that seeks to disarm and dispossess the people that they were elected to serve. And with that, sorry, I'm gonna go.
How do you feel about donor-driven rebuilding when the donor-driven project is driven by a hedge fund or as we see in Puerto Rico, a capitalist organization that basically dispossesses the land, the people, and creates wealth through the exploitation of those spaces?
You asking me the question, sorry?
I'm asking all of you, how do we respond to that? Because that is the challenge. Because even as we rebuild, that's how we rebuild.
Okay. Being mindful of the time, I know for sure that Harvey talks about the fact or mentions this. To be honest with you, I'd have to think a little more on how to come up with ideas. What I do know is that if we can stop legislation from moving to that point, that's a great answer to this ever coming, I guess, to this point that we've seen. With that kind of legislation in place, I'm scared, because if it happens here in New Providence, in the capital, that means that they could tell me that this area is now no longer inhabitable and we can't come here. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for my family? What does that mean for the people who called this place home? They won't even let you come and gather your belongings, right? And so you get into some very muddy terrain that's very, I guess, just ambiguous and ubiquitous. It's a never-ending cycle of impossibility, I think, that you always have to be worried about. And with that, I think that we're at the 60-minute mark.
Okay, so I would like to thank all of you for being a part of this discussion. And I'd like to thank Ethan, Diandra, and Nantino for working along with us on this project and for making this presentation possible. And we open up the floor now to live questions and answers, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
All right, so this was a really great presentation. Currently, we don't have any questions, so I will start off with my own question. I wonder, as a group, if you could tell us a little bit more about the methodological approach. So you did say that you visited Ragged Island, and Ethan did mention that it was anthropological, but could you just tell us a little bit more about how the engagement with the community happened and what were some of the kind of key findings that helped to lead you to some of the very core conclusions that you've presented to us? So it's to all of you, so whoever wants to answer first.
Okay, so going on the trip, we had to go on a what they call a ferry or a boat. So this is the mail boat. This is the one boat that goes to Ragged Island. But during the process, we stopped in the Exumas. We stopped in, I think it was it Black Point or Staniel Key, right, Ethan? It was that? I think it was Staniel Key.
We made multiple stops, but yeah, that was like one of the longer ones.
So we stopped in Staniel Key, then Black Point. I think we was in there for like a couple hours. But along the journey, you get to see how the Bahamas becomes a playground for the rich, it's particularly in the Exuma Keys, right? Because this one particular island we stopped to that had mail and other supplies to be dropped off, the sign on the island said that no trespassing, right? This island was owned by one person who had a staff that I know had to be mostly Bahamian, but they said that if you step foot on the island, you would be shot, right? Signs were up, no trespassing, private property. And Dr. Bethel Bennett began to talk to us about what all of that means in the context of us living on the one island, which is the capital, New Providence. You don't get to see that. And as we made our way down to Ragged Island and we began to speak with the people, like you kind of realize how small the community is, because Ragged Island is set on a hilltop, right? The island is, again, this is the one mailboat that comes to this island to provide it with the necessities for the food store, anything that the Royal Bahamas Defense Force or the island administrator needs, it comes through this one boat. And so as we walked up, we began immediately, you see the destruction. You get past the salt pond and you see buildings like knocked down. That's it. Like the whole communities were flattened. The whole community was flattened. There were one or two houses that had not sustained any damage, but it was one small road. You could literally drive the island from one end of the island to the next in about 20 minutes. That's how small the community was, right? Or maybe an hour, right? Or maybe 30 minutes. But the minute you see that, you kind of get the sense of like, how do these people make it? And they began to tell us, because during our ethnographic, whilst we were doing the interviews, a lot of them began to tell us about their fears about what the government was failing to do for them, right? One of the big things that came up, no matter what interview we did, was that they were scared the government wanted to get them off the land so that they could sell or privatize the land and give it to a transnational company or a private investor. And the reason why they said that was because Little Ragged Island, which is right next door, and you could see from the tip of like standing on the hill, was being sold for about $1.4 million. Now, this is an island, right? That is a public space. For one island to be sold like that, and for these islands to be continuously sold like that, it just screams a bit of like, how is the government able to sell a whole piece of public land just like that? That's the first question that begins to rise. And so when you hear the Ragged Islanders talk about their fears about their government pushing them off of the land, and being intentional about not building facilities like school, clinic, the police station, it took them almost 2.5 years to get that done. And so the families told us that they sent their children to school in New Providence, in Exuma, in another family island where family was, but they refused to leave their homes because that's all they know, and they didn't want to live in New Providence. They don't like the fast pace of New Providence. They don't like the fast pace of Grand Bahama. They don't like it. They like the quality of just fishing and coming and going. They like the life that they've cultivated in that rural, not rural area, but that area that they've cultivated. They don't want to do all of that. They don't want fast food. They just want to be able to live off the land that they've been able to have. So those were some of the things. I don't know if Ethan could tell us, I guess, his perspective, and Dr. Bethel Bennett.
Mm-hmm. So just sort of expanding on the question of methodological approaches. So as Nantino mentioned, we conducted a series of interviews, both on the mailboat itself and on the island itself. So we spoke with, I think, at least 5 to 7 residents. And then we also recorded video of several of the interviews. We also took portraits, and we also then used these materials for a later exhibition at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas that was titled also Hot Water. So this was our sort of like kind of formal approach, but as Nantino touched on, we were also in the business of observation. We were kind of taking notes of what we saw, absorbing a fairly grim scene, I would say, in which you had only sort of a handful of families that had remained, most of which had kind of relocated to the capital, as is usually done in the wake of such storms. But it wasn't sort of just kind of focusing on like the aftermath. We also got to learn a little bit about the historical kind of ongoings of that island. For instance, they used to have varieties of interactions with Cuba, which is very close by. There was sort of like shared radio stations. Historically, the island has undertaken a lot of salt production, given its low-lying semi-arid state. and the formation of natural salt ponds. So it was this whole process of getting to know this space, the history of this space, which is not unlike a lot of the other sort of southern islands in the Bahamas, but which is quite different from the capital where we all reside. So it was this process of learning, this process of trying to understand, and then there's also this process of kind of bringing these stories, these ideas, this plight, and these concerns to a broader audience in the most sensitive, respectful, and careful manner that we could. So this was the general sort of process we undertook as a group.
Okay, so I have another question. So could you explain, so the Prime Minister spoke about a green island. Did he illuminate through, all right, first just tell us what he means by green island, and then you can tell me about the responsiveness in terms of the community responding to it, and then probably we can then jump back into the findings about your arguments around cultural retention and how the internal migration in Bahamas results in this kind of cultural retention as a result of disaster.
Okay, so I'll just start. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the premise for the Green Island, I think, was like the result of the Bahamas entering this conversation about global warming and climate change and moving more towards like renewable energy, right? And so we were kind of presented with this idea of, establishing a space that would rely on like solar energy, like, probably hydroelectricity, that sort of thing. Of course, the skepticism of the Ragged Island community, as well as the larger Bahamian population, is that we've been talking for years. You've had climate activists talking for years about the importance of moving towards like renewable energy, as well as, taking like hurricane preparedness like seriously, as well as, like moving towards like, cleaner energy, like, the importance of recycling, that sort of thing. And there hasn't really been that great of a government involvement or support. And so it kind of seemed like, we've been sold dreams before. We've been told that these grand things are going to happen, and oftentimes it's a plan that's presented in a way that is really going to allow outsiders or bigger companies or private investors to come in and benefit from the dream, right? So I didn't really go on the trip, so I really can't say like what was the response specifically from the Ragged Islanders, but I'm responding from the point of like the wider population. Like we've heard this before. We've been sold these grand dreams by the government, and you haven't necessarily followed through. And it's like, okay, so now it's now 2021. Irma hit in 2017, and then you said that we were going to establish this Green Island. You said that you were going to work on hurricane preparedness, and then Dorian hits, and it's an even greater disaster. And you have to, like, the conversation comes up again. And once again, we're put in the position as a country to say, like, okay, what are we doing? Right? Like, what's happening? How are we preparing ourselves for these events? And like, how are we like trying to recover from these events?
So to add to that, to answer the question plainly, we don't know what he meant because it was never written down. And that's just the honest truth. We don't know. Nobody knows.
There's also that.
Legit, nobody knows. And then if it was written down, we don't have access to it. So that's the big problem here. A lot of things are said in Parliament or they're enacted, and we don't have access to the information. So all we know is he had an idea for Green Island. Whoop-de-doo. We've heard that before. Now what? Where's the paper? What is the plan? We don't know the plan. When he got on TV, it was just another, like Diandra said, it was another dream being sold. And so the response from Ragged Islanders, they were protesting in Roston Square because they felt neglected. They felt abandoned by the government, right? It was at the making of that video, nothing had been done. It was all, nothing had been done up until that time. When that video came out, then for the first time, we knew what the plan, a little bit of the plan was, and that was to put electrical grids on the ground that was solar panel. That was the first thing that we heard. So to our amazement, we were like, oh, so this is what y'all planning to do. But yet you on TV pontificating, acting like you're doing something. But this is what we continuously have to deal with. So by the time as he gets on TV, they've already put in place these kinds of measures to make themselves look good, but we're left in the dark. And it just, you have that kind of dynamic going on. And so to answer the question, we didn't know until he got on TV and said that. And then afterwards, he had to take CNN on 60 Minutes, the crew there. That's when everything started to unfold. And then in January 2021, you began to see the first building. They took pictures and they gave us the pictures of what they had started to build from that time. Because what they're gonna do is the minute they have to pontificate on TV for international communities, they will do that and follow through with their plans just to make themselves look good on paper. That's all that they do.
Right. Okay. So we have a question here. So the first question is, and it's from our colleague, Alexandra Gooding. So she wants to know, what can we do as individual cultural workers and or institutions and organizations to levy governments to do for more support in disaster preparedness, more specifically for our cultural heritage? Because definitely in terms of the interviews, that would have been important. And so so that's really her question. And how do we advocate to get governments on board for ensuring cultural institutions and monuments are protected or prepared to survive as much as possible a natural disaster? So in terms of preparing ahead.
Okay, so I'll tackle question one. It's really important to continue to do the work. So we have to continue to speak up when you have these opportunities to talk about like what's happening, to get people on board, to get the word out. Because I find in particular, especially in the Bahamas, like some people, like they're just not going to care, and a lot of times they're not aware of what's going on. They're when you bring up these issues to them, they're like they have no idea. And so it's really important that we're constantly getting this information out. And because when you stand on, I feel like you stand on a soapbox long enough, you talk long enough, eventually your message is going to get out and it's going to get to the people who it needs to get to. And eventually, you'll be able to affect change. So continue to do the work. When you have the spaces to advocate for these issues, like do so. Try to get people on board. When you see that certain corporations or certain organizations are hosting like town hall meetings, or they're hosting workshops, like get involved with that. Like share that stuff on social media, share it with your friends, try to get like more people involved. And so as a body, that's what, as a group, that's what we've been doing. We are having these conversations when we can have the conversations. And like I said, we're sharing with our family, we're sharing with our friends, we're sharing on our social media platforms. So that's my take on question one. Ethan or Nantino, you can add to it or move on to question two.
So for question number two, besides speaking up and advocating and challenging the status quo, from an institutional, organizational kind of standpoint, I think it's important because as I've watched some of the presentations, one of the things I often think about is, because I thought about how much times I only started to go into the NAGB space here in the Bahamas when I entered college, right? And so if we have to have a multi-pronged approach from an institutional or organizational kind of standpoint that takes into account the lived reality of the people we're trying to serve. If we're trying to get them in our spaces, then we need to know what they're faced with. And if they're faced with dispossession, then you have to step in and counter that dispossession. Right? If you want them to enter your space, you have to make your space and your space safe enough for them to want to enter. Because if I'm hungry and you have no way to solve that for me, I'm not coming to your space. Right? If I need someone to advocate for me, then whatever we're doing in our spaces has to answer their needs. It has to meet their needs in a tangible kind of way, right? Whether that means directly challenging the government on certain positions, whether that means using artwork in particular kinds of ways that start conversations, all of these, you have to do it, right? And so I'll say this. I think, so I've been visiting the NAGB in particular while under the while Holly Bino was there, and I can say from my interaction with her while she was there, she listened, she challenged the government on certain positions, and she stood fast in terms of bringing in artwork and artists that actually push the narrative and push the conversation forward, right? You need someone like that and those people around her who help to facilitate that kind of vision. That needs to be consistently be done, right? You cannot just stop. It cannot just stop because she was there or she was one of the main persons pushing, or whoever it was at the top. Right? I think Amanda Coulson was also one of the persons who is no longer there. There has to be a continuity of that kind of dialogue, and there has to be a taking into account of those very vulnerable communities who we're trying to serve and what their needs are. If we're not going to do that from an organizational standpoint, then we might as well not exist. And listen, I don't have time to play. I don't have time to pretty it up and be bureaucratic. I don't have time for that. We're trying to help people make their lives and the quality of their lives better, right? And if we're not doing that, you might as well pack it up and go home, because this is what the work is about. I'm not here doing research because I love it and I'm going to pat myself on the back. No, I want to help people. And if that's not what you're in this for, then just pack it up, right? I think, Ethan, if you have something to add to that, then sure.
Yeah, I think speaking to sort of like civil society more broadly, I think we need to elect leaders that carry on like Prime Minister Mia Mottley, that go to sort of the COP26 and that bring the sort of global inequalities that have brought about climate change and that threaten to dispossess all small island developing states. I think we need to elect people on a regional level like that, who are sort of bringing these issues to light and not letting leaders of the global north sort of like, you know, run with their tail between their legs. Because at the end of the day, like, I mean, can these storms are going to continue getting worse, and, you know, disasters will continue to strike unless changes are made at the international level. So this might be a bit pessimistic, but I really don't think there's that much that we can do besides expressing our voice in civil society as individual citizens. But in the meantime, to safeguard cultural heritage, I would champion documentary work. I would champion sort of a greater investment in the cultural sphere in general throughout the region, so that even in the event that, you know, certain spaces are destroyed, people are displaced, we still have cultural artifacts. We have sort of records of what it was like and what it might continue to be. You know, like it's similar to what Nantino had said earlier about epistemic violence. There's a sense of like there's a hierarchy in what is worth knowing and what we are allowed to know. You know, not just on a national level, but like internationally. It's like I know so much about like the US, North America, and also Europe, but I barely know anything about Turks and Caicos, and they right there. So it's this sense of we need to sort of produce this knowledge and then make it more accessible in a region that has historically been divided by colonialism and by water. So this sense of two-prong approach from my point of view. We need better leaders, and we, in the meantime, need to be taking notes, taking pictures, making videos. That's my point of view.
Right, absolutely. I agree with you, Ethan. And I also think it's also about when we're in our regional organizations like this, that we represent, participate, and bring our voices to the table, because that's part of doing the cross-Caribbean work, regardless of your political status. Ethan, my next question is really specifically to you about the feedback from the exhibition that you guys did, and how did your Bahamian publics respond, and what does it how did they respond? Because I think you've said that you've championing kind of like proper documentation.
So I actually, when the exhibition came out, I had actually gone to university, so I wasn't there for the opening night, and I only returned in the Christmas. So I think Nantino might be better kind of equipped to answer this question, but I can say that that from what I heard after the fact was that, because I wrote a series of short stories that were informed by this visit, and which kind of like speak to what I was just saying, which is, you know, this documentation of important stories. So not to deflect your question, I would love to answer questions from you, but I think Nantino is a bit more in the know.
No, I completely understand your response. Nantino?
Well, so during the time, so I didn't get to go to the opening either because I had school and there's a little complication around that. But from what I heard, it was great. So I did the script. Me and a friend of mine, Ide and Moya, I think Thompson was her name. We did the script for the piece. I can tell you what it was because I'd been there up until the opening time because I didn't get to go because I was doing schoolwork. We had these 2 huge gallon of containers, and we filled them with water, and they were in the space, and they were lit up with this blue light that signified water for us. And then we had, I think we had some other pieces going around the exhibition. I can't remember what it was, what were on them, but I remember we did have a script for each person to walk into to kind of think about as they were going through the exhibition. And it dealt with this kind of idea of this I think it was a underwater kind of community that was positing, okay, this is what's going on in our community. This is how our community is just being destroyed. Yeah, I haven't looked at it since, so it's kind of fleeting my mind right now. But I remember that's what our concept was. That's as much as I can tell you right now. I could be honest.
Okay, so the exhibition is really an art installation that featured both paintings of from various artists.
Yes, it had.
Right.
So yes,
with
it was.
Let me just finish with a focus on environmental and sustainable engagements and the impact on people. So it's really like a kind of mixed media art installation slash with engaging environmental climate change issues.
Yes.
Okay, but in terms of feedback, did you guys have a lot of feedback from in the newspapers and social media? I
knew. So from what I heard, it was a great reception to it. Again, the NAGB, for all intents and purposes, even though it's situated in a very kind of rural area, a lot of the people that enter those spaces are from higher society. And so definitely they would have reacted in a very positive light. I can't say whether or not the people that we were intending to really reach to, that message got to them. And that was always my issue. No matter what we do, that because the NAGB space in particular is a privileged kind of space, it has a certain, they have to do extra work in order to get those people into those spaces. And they have done that. I'm not saying that they haven't, but to continuously do that, sometimes it takes a lot of effort. And I don't know if the crux of the people that we were looking to get the message to, which is the people who are being dispossessed, got that message. So the regular people who often visit NAGB, they definitely may have loved it. Some may have not, but it was a great reception from what I heard.
Okay, so go ahead, Ethan. Yes.
I would also add that so the 4 short stories that I wrote were actually printed and placed on display in the exhibition, but they were also published by the Nassau Guardian, which is one of the most read newspapers in the country. So I imagine that had a fairly substantial readership because it was both, I think, online and in print. But as Nantino stated, we don't know, specifically because I wasn't on island, I don't know the specific maybe impact that the exhibition itself did have, but I do know that there was a substantial sort of promotion. The NAGB blog did various articles on it. And so I would say to the extent that we could have advertised the exhibition, I think that was achieved. It was also a broader group of cultural workers. There was a collective called Plastico Fantastico with a variety of international artists. So it's likely that it also extended beyond, the boundaries of the nation state. So I would say that as it was an ambitious project and that it did have substantial reach. To quantify that reach, I would be less qualified. Yeah.
Okay. So coming back to the research and the findings on Ragged Island, would you say that in terms of unpacking the narrative of disaster capitalism, which you've all kind of defined in your research, could you more kind of because some of this too is because quite a few of our audience members are not from the Bahamas. So for example, I'm from Jamaica. So I've been to the Bahamas, but I haven't been in that area. And I know that, what's it called? Island renovation on HGTV. I know that there were some people from Canada doing some housing thing on one of the islands, and they covered, I think it was Dorian, and their response to Dorian. Very nice consumer tourism stuff, you know, that happens when they do island living on HGTV. But so one of the things I kind of want to get a better sense in terms of the unpacking of disaster capitalism is how this is manifested in your interviews, because disaster capitalism to me, based on the discussion that we're having, is a very academic term. But on the ground, have they, in the interviews, did the community coin their own notion of what this is, right? How would they, how would you, through the interviews, identify what they are defining as a kind of disaster capitalism complex, and also what it means for their understanding of their identity? Because you hinted to it earlier, but very clearly, Ragged Island and Small Ragged Island has a particular identity that the community buys into. And so I'm trying to get a sense of how did they conceptualize themselves within this context of climate change and disaster preparedness, in light of the fact that Ivan and Dorian are really less than 5 years apart. I think it's 3 years, and Dorian was significantly worse. So, and have you guys gone back to do any additional findings from post-Dorian, for example?
Okay, well, so they consider themselves as a fishing kind of community. That was evident. Boats are all over they have a harbor kind of little area, marshy area that goes into the mangroves that they use to get out into the ocean. Boats are all around. So they consider them a very small fishing community. I think, as was stated by either Ethan or Diandra, the ties to Cuba, Haiti, and that's important, right? Because of the way that we deal with people of Haitian descent in the Bahamas. Haiti was a significant kind of port or trading kind of country for the southern region. As far as we know from the interviews, I can't really say that they coined their own term for disaster capitalism. All they did know was that they were suspicious of the government, and they felt as if the only way to protect their land and their family was to stay put on their land. That was what they knew. And in several interviews, I'll never forget one of the most riveting ones where I cried, right? I think Ethan, I don't know, we were standing inside this man's house. Half of his roof had been torn off, and he just started to, I don't know if he cried, but his voice, the way that he was talking about what he had experienced, how he had gone through Irma, it just broke me, because to hear his skepticism, to hear how he had been left on his own, and you saw him mixing the cement outside, right, as we approached. When we got in, he took us and he showed us in. It was a small place, but he said that this was all that he had. This is who and what he had. This is who he was. This is what he had. And he was disappointed that his own government had left him like in the state. And all I can remember is that moment just made me realize that the work that we're doing and the stories that we are helping to amplify, it not only means something, but it may be the only hope to get us to reverse and go in the next direction. There was another man that we interviewed who said that he strapped himself to the tree on this one particular island. I can't remember. He was an old gentleman, right? An older gentleman. And he said that he had strapped himself to the tree, tied himself to the tree on this particular island because he had gotten stuck there. And he said that he weathered the storm from just under a coconut tree. And to hear those stories that may sound, kind of out there, but when you hear the way that he tells this very compelling story, the only thing that we know from the interviews is that they have a strong sense of who they are, and their offspring who live in New Providence. Some of them are doctors, some of them are lawyers. They have a whole association that they meet monthly. And so this is a community that is worth saving, because even though it may be 30 or 40 persons or 50 persons, it is a community that they want to keep. And the only thing that we heard throughout that process was that they felt like the government was trying to get rid of this community. And that was something that they were not willing to give up because it meant something to them. And that's what I think is their idea. I think their sense of community was much more stronger than their willingness to let that community go. Because it has a history. It means something to them, and they want their children to grow up. In one of the other interviews, this gentleman, he showed us his bird coop. He has a bunch of birds, and he sells the eggs, and he packages the eggs. And it was just fascinating to see. It's the sense of just day-to-day living. So I don't think that they had a concept of disaster capitalism, and that may be the case. Sometimes we can't articulate that, but they knew what they wanted their life and the quality of their life to be like, and that was important for them to not give up under any circumstances.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Ethan.
Just to expand on that, there was, this discussion of land grab as an idea, which is fairly, I'd say, similar in a concept. I'm not sure if you would want to supply that term or if it came from the people themselves. But regardless, this question of land grab, whether it was named or not, I think was understood, because having the sense that the land could be taken away is to also know that it has been in the past. So absolutely. I think we might not have the vocabulary for certain things, but we might still have an understanding of what like potential reality is. So definitely palpable, the sense of risk, of danger, of potential dispossession. And to answer the question of have we followed up personally, we have not done a second trip to Ragged Island. However, various media outlets, newspapers have done follow-up articles 2 years and 3 years post-Irma, and these have kind of given insights into this running water, the Prime Minister wants to do this with the island, which honestly, I think my real issue with that proposal is that it is possible. Taking the mailboat down there, we saw windmills, being a semi-arid climate with little rainfall, there is the potential to harvest solar energy. So that's my biggest issue. It's been done on Bonaire in the Dutch Caribbean. I am fully under the belief that it could be done on Ragged Island. And so to kind of have this proposal, which is within the realm of possibility, and then to not kind of see that process through is disappointing. As a Bahamian, it's a very disappointing thing to see.
Right. Okay, so unfortunately, we have to wrap up. I really just want to thank you all. I mean, this is really a true lesson on cultural work and climate activism and the kinds of work that we need to do as cultural and museum practitioners in the region. I want to thank all our attendees for coming today. And please, our next session is stay tuned for Verve Creations Mix and Sip. That starts at 3:30 p.m. And if you have any more questions and would like to speak to our presenters, please click on the networking menu on the left side of your screen, where you can scroll through and start a conversation. Also, feel free to use the chat icon. And if you have any needs for help, please help for navigating our conference platform, please speak to one of the ushers. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.